Welcome to Civics and Coffee, a history podcast, the show all about United States history, delivered to you in the time it takes to enjoy your morning cup of coffee. I'm your host, Alicia, a historian trained in United States history with a passion for telling both the known and unknown parts of America's past. So grab your coffee and get ready for some bite-sized history. Hey everyone, welcome back. This week's conversation was actually inspired by my friend and former graduate school colleague, Rosanna, who, like my guest, is a knitting enthusiast. I was and am envious of her skill, so when I had the chance to talk to Dr. Nehrig about her project, I knew I had to say yes. Dr. Nicole Nehrig is a trained psychologist who wrote an insightful analysis of the evolution of weaving and knitting and the women behind this work. The book, With Her Own Hands, explores both the historic evolution and the psychological processes involved in making cloth. It was truly an illuminating conversation, and one I hope you all enjoy. Hello, everyone. Joining me today is Dr. Nicole Nehrig. She is a clinical and research psychologist based in Brooklyn, New York, with a deep passion for knitting and textile arts. She holds a PhD in clinical psychology and is the author of the book With Her Own Hands, which will be the focus of our conversation today. Welcome, Dr. Nehrig.
Thanks, Alicia.
All right, let's dive right in. Your book begins with the argument that creating clothing is one of the most critical contributions to society. Can you expand on this and share how you came to this conclusion?
Yeah, for one, it really facilitated human survival. Humans just couldn't have survived in many parts of the world in the climates that exist without it. Wool is insulating and water resistant. Linen regulates temperature and wicks away sweat. You know, it's really critical to our abilities to have moved around the world the way we have. Elizabeth Wayland Barber, who wrote Women's Work, calls the invention of cloth, or rather the string that makes cloth, the string revolution, because she believes that without it, people would not have been able to spread around the world. It tamed the world to human will. And then it's also been really critical to the development of world economy, advances in technology. You know, trading along the Silk Roads was, created a lot of communication between different cultures and intermingling of people. The modern computer is based on the loom. So, I mean, it's been a pretty major contribution from, even just the existence of human civilization as we know it to, modern advances in technology.
And this is a kind of an incredible book in the sense that it explores the history of textiles. So what inspired your research into textile history?
So I've been knitting myself for about 20 years, and it's been really meaningful to me. And as a psychologist, I tend to look at what is this doing for me? How is this reflecting something about what's going on in my life? And it's served as a metaphor for a lot of things in my life. And also I've realized has like really fulfilled certain sources of meaning for me at times. Like it has been a creative outlet during the pandemic when life was kind of all focused on the home for that period and meaning had to be made with the materials of the home. Knitting fulfilled things that a lot of other home activities did not fulfill. I didn't find like creative solutions for like cleaning my bathroom, but I found a lot of creative solutions in my knitting and, ways to combine colors in different ways and turn the heel of a sock in a way that I particularly preferred. And so that there was these like kind of intellectual and creative things that it satisfied. And also it connected me with people, through online communities. I have knitting friends and we were sharing a lot of what we were making during the pandemic with each other. And it was something that we could share that felt more positive than like, oh my gosh, I'm going insane right now. And, what do I do with my kids today, on yet another day at home together with, Zoom school and really like nothing else, me just having to figure out like baking projects or, activities for us to do. So it really fulfilled a lot, and it made me think, okay, at other times and places when people's lives were centered around the home, what did this work mean to people? And so I was really curious about what this work meant to women in other times and places, and how they made meaning out of this work, how it was fulfilling in some way to our more psychological needs for connection, for creativity, and being able to have a voice and maybe earn a living or feel like our work is valued, feel connected to our communities. So that was what got me started.
And so, what I love about this book is that it's both historical and it kind of looks at the psychological. So, to touch on some of the history here for a minute, how is cloth making tied to accusations of witchcraft?
Well, so it's a source of power, of course, which has been threatening. Women having power, that's always been a little suspect. There are a bunch of like 15th and 16th century depictions of women riding naked on distaffs. Durr has a great etching of this, or dominating men with distaffs, which maybe expresses a sense of, threat or worry about what women might do with this kind of power. But also, it brought women together in a shared activity that was largely not within men's purview. It was something women did, in certain areas like Iceland. There were like weaving houses, and women would go to this weaving house and weave together. It's where the loom was set up. And so it was a place where women kind of joined each other outside of the realm of men. And I think there was a lot of suspicion maybe about what happened in those places removed from men's sight. And there was some like mythology and things around this too, that, it was dangerous for men to enter a weaving house. And so maybe women just didn't want men around. And came up with these things, or there might have been some sort of other mythical ideas about these dangers of men kind of intermingling with women in this place. And there have also been kind of rituals and ceremonies around the weaving process, like asking the spirits for, help weaving a good cloth, or, protecting the weaver from harm or from evil spirits during the weaving. There were also kind of chants just to remember certain patterns, or songs that women would sing to remember certain patterns that might have been kind of mistaken as like invocations or chants for, communing with the devil or something like that. So I think there have been these like actual practices, and then maybe these historical connections to a sort of magic or mystical tradition might have also strengthened ties to fears about witchcraft later, when, during the witch craze of the 15th century and everything, that it's possible that these exact things weren't quite in the air anymore the way that they had been in the past. They were maybe more anchored to like actual practices. They became part of the folklore surrounding weaving, and it maybe became a little tricky to disentangle what was actually happening during women's weaving, if there were these kinds of magical and potentially dangerous things happening.
And you speak of community and how that kind of drove this suspicion and accusations of witchcraft. And so, how was making textiles connected to knowledge sharing networks among women?
Yeah, well, again, it was something that brought women together. So they learned from each other, not just about textile work, but about things that were happening in their communities and each other's homes. Philosophical and political ideas were shared. It was a time when women got together and had a lot of time to talk. And so there were ideas shared about making textiles, like, oh, I came up with this pattern. Oh, I like that pattern, and I'm going to adapt it. And that's, how we've got some classic weaving structures and quilting patterns and things like that. But also, this is something I'm reading about, and, this is influencing me. There's this religious ideology that I'm learning about, or there's this, stuff about like women's voting that I'm hearing about. And, here's a place where we can talk about it. And women were exposed to feminist ideology and knitting and stitching circles. The suffragists stitched banners to carry in their protests. So there's been a lot of ways that women coming together has allowed them to share ideas, not just about what they're making, but about what they're thinking about, and has encouraged some activism in that regard too.
And so, speaking or shifting, I guess, from women broadly to a specific woman, who was Elizabeth Zimmerman and what impact did she have on the home knitting industry in the United States?
So she was a knitwear designer and knitting instructor in the mid 20th century. She was living in the Midwest. The way she wrote about patterns and the way she taught knitting was really different than was typical at the time. Instead of writing patterns for people to kind of like blindly follow, which was more the way it had been done, just trusting the designer to know what's best, and you just do what the designer tells you and you should end up with the thing that you're supposed to end up with. She really gave knitters the tools to adapt patterns and experiment and kind of learn the skills to make their knitting their own, which was really revolutionary at the time and really not the way patterns were written and intended. There weren't a lot of books that really taught like the different skills or taught you different ways of binding off or different ways to finish a pattern. She really gave people this information that, like, unless you had someone in your community or your family that knew how to do all these different things and was like very technically skilled as a knitter, you probably wouldn't know, and you would just be kind of following these step-by-step instructions. There's a great depiction of this in Breakfast at Tiffany's where Audrey Hepburn is like, I think I'm knitting a sweater, but maybe I'm knitting a house. Like, she might have gotten the like her knitting pattern mixed up with the architectural plans for a ranch house. And, she's like, I don't really know. I'm just following I'm just like following the instructions. So, yeah, she encouraged knitters to experiment, figure out what works for them, be able to make their own unique designs and patterns. And she said something like, no two people are alike, no two sweaters should be alike either, right? Like each thing should be your own original recipe, kind of. So it opened up a world for knitters and, play in their knitting and try out new things and like be brave. One fan letter to Elizabeth Zimmerman compared her to Julia Childs, like, you're the Julia Childs of knitting. That, she was really giving people the ways and means to kind of innovate and think for themselves in their knitting.
And I love how this book doesn't always only focus on community and kind of knowledge sharing, but it also dives into labor history. So, how did textiles move women and their ideas beyond the domestic sphere?
Yeah, I mean, women's textiles have moved all over the world. They were traded and sold, and they've been passed down through generations of families. We still find old quilts in thrift shops and antique textiles in, people's collections and galleries and museums. Like, we really what was made in the home did not stay in the home. So these textiles have moved all over the world. There have been these major trade routes where textiles from different cultures have been traded and influenced each other. And then it's been a way that women have participated in the economy for, probably thousands of years. We know that women were selling textiles. Women were largely the ones making the cloth. Men at times have been too involved in that, and in certain places and times it's a very shared activity, but it was more often women, in part because it's, something that is compatible with childcare. And so part of that division of labor meant that it was somewhat more the sphere of in the sphere of women. But women have woven cloth that was actually currency. Like in Iceland, the cloth was currency, a form of currency, and a certain amount of cloth was equal to a certain amount of silver. So women could weave the cloth that paid the taxes, and traded and exchanged for things that were needed. So like women were kind of making the money, quite literally. So it's been this incredibly important way that women have participated in the economy, in sharing ideas and exchange of culture, and shaping culture. It's been incredibly important in so many areas.
Yeah, I know. I want to explore and expand on that previous point where you're talking about opening opportunities to explore cultures and identities. How has textile production created opportunities for women to create connections over their work?
Well, so much of it was done together. So it was a team effort. It's a lot of work. So it had to be shared, whether it was shared between members of a household. You had a loom set up, and people, as they had time, would come and take turns working at the loom or, doing dyeing. That's a huge undertaking, right? Especially the way dyes have traditionally been made with natural plants and bugs and, all these materials that are very labor intensive to gather, to, then kind of make into a dye, and then the dyeing. So those were often very communal activities where, there'd be a lot of women working together to gather the materials, create the dye pot, and then all take turns dyeing their wool or linen or whatever cotton in it, so that that effort could be shared. So it was a way to, bring people together in a shared activity, connecting through their work, relying on each other. I saw a great line about how when women would get together to finish a quilt, each woman would maybe do her own piecework of the top of the quilt, but then the actual quilting was often done in kind of quilting bees, where a lot of women would gather together and they'd have a frame that they'd put the quilt in. And these were like big, pieces that were expensive. Not everybody could have one in their home and everything. So they'd kind of take turns putting their quilts into the quilting frame. And a lot of women would work at the same time, quilting the layers of the quilt together and finishing the quilt. And so if your sewing skills weren't up to snuff, if you were not a good sewer, then you might mess up somebody else's quilt. So it was really important that everybody have, these skills. All the women in a community have these skills so that they could help each other with these activities.
And you also talk about viewing textiles as a way to see women's storytelling. So, can you expand on this and how we can see these stories?
Yeah, some are very straightforward. Like there are actual story cloths that are created. The Miao people in China make story cloths which depict, things about their culture. They're embroidered cloths. They don't have a written language. So embroidery is called nushu, which translate to women's script. And it's a way of recording the stories of their culture. It's also when girls make their wedding dresses, starting in their teen years, they start stitching what will be their wedding dresses, and they embroider like their hopes and dreams into these dresses. They're who they are. It's part of how they even like develop their identity and, start to tell their story, stitching into this cloth. During the Pinochet regime in Chile in the 1970s, people were making story cloths called arpilleras, where mostly women were making these cloths out of the fabric from lost loved ones. People were just disappearing during this time, and they were recounting what was happening in Chile. This was a time when information was not getting out of the country, but cloth is kind of goes under the radar. And so it was a way that people were kind of smuggling information out of the country to let people know this is what's happening here. People are going missing, people are being killed, soldiers are coming and like burning down the houses and everything. Like it's a terrible time. And it was a way that they recorded that history. We know the Bayeux Tapestry, which was this embroidered account of William the Conqueror's conquest of England in 1066. And like that's this whole long embroidered story of, what went down, or at least what the the Normans wanted to say what went down. But yeah, there are all of these ways that they convey stories, and in more subtle ways too. If you look at a quilt and you just think somebody arranged this, and probably arranged it historically from pieces of leftover fabric from their kids' clothes, or worn out aprons, or you know some bed sheets from around the house and everything. And like, you can look at that and you can see someone's life in that quilt. You can
Mm,
see maybe all the clothes they made for their children cut up and reused in this quilt. And so there's a lot of ways that these stories, if you look for them, are there in the cloth.
yeah. And stepping back a little bit, how does learning this history enhance our understanding of women's work?
Yeah, my hope with this book was to see more of the woman behind the woman's work. What did this work mean to the women who did it? Was it a creative outlet? Was it a way to process difficult emotions, connect with friends? Did it keep her up at night working out a complex pattern or design idea? Was it a dreaded chore at times? Was she so tired of toiling away at the loom? But, that you can look at a quilt on someone's bed and be like, "Oh yeah, my grandma made that for me," or, "That was my mom's," or something. But like, to really think about, what did it mean to her to make this thing, stitch by stitch. This is no like quick and easy thing that she dashed off. This was like hours, weeks, maybe months of her time, maybe years even, if she was weaving all the cloth that ended up going into making this quilt, if she was, sewing all the clothes for all her children and then cutting up those clothes and making this quilt. It could be like years of her life and her work. What did that mean to her? Who was that woman behind that work?
And this book also explores the psychology surrounding knitting, and we've kind of touched on it a little bit, but how do textile techniques serve as a metaphor for psychological processes?
I think there are so many great ways, just even with the language. We talk about like unraveling, which we could think of as a psychological process, definitely one that I felt like I was experiencing during the pandemic, and unraveling cloth. We can talk about weaving things together, knitting things together, like bringing ideas together and integrating parts of ourselves and everything. And also the coming apart. Sometimes we need to come apart a bit and reorganize ourselves. So I think there's a lot of rich metaphor. There's also just a lot I found in my work as a psychologist. There's so much that's intangible. And I think that's true of what so many people do, especially nowadays in kind of a technological age. Our work is not tangible. And there's something that's so grounding and helpful in making something tangible, making something with our hands. I can spend an hour in a therapy session and like not really know, have we really made a lot of progress? Is this, helping? Is this where we need to be going? But I can spend an hour knitting and I can have 6 more inches of a scarf or something done. And, I can see my progress. I can ground myself in that. I am, you know, doing something that's, that I can see, that I can feel. If I make a mistake, I can unravel and fix it. Or, it's something that we don't get the experience of in our day to day lives all the time. And it can be a way to kind of meet psychological needs that are harder to meet in day to day life. It feels really good to just be able to have this kind of circumscribed activity where there are lots of possibilities and like we can choose one and the stakes are pretty low. And if it doesn't turn out the way we want it, we can, rip out the pieces or tear back the knitting or whatever to make it what we want it to be. It offers a lot of fulfillment for things that are harder to find day to day.
And this book is so impressive in terms of its scope. Not only is it, a psychological perspective of knitting and this big, broad history of knitting and textile work. So I'm curious, how did you kind of decide where to focus your research energy?
I knew it couldn't be comprehensive. As soon as soon as I kind of started scratching the surface, it was like, "Oh my gosh, there's, just endless amounts of information here." And I did 45 interviews of textile creators or historians or anthropologists, archaeologists, but there were, millions of people I could have talked to, and everybody that I've talked to about my book or, met at events and everything has stories to tell and stuff. So, like, there was just that was helpful to just know, because I come from an academic research background where, of course, like in a lit review, you want to make sure you're, citing all of the important papers that are relevant to your subject and everything. This was like, well, that's just not possible. So that was liberating in a way, and a shift away from my kind of academic background. So I kind of, to use a textile metaphor, followed the thread, and I, read things that led me to other things. I talked to people who then said, "Oh, you should talk to this person," or "Do you know this person's work? I think you'd find it really interesting," or "You might like the way they talk about their work. It's very psychological," or something. So I really just kind of went with where the data took me, and where connections with people took me. And then I did that kind of until I felt like I had heard what I needed to, like, kind of fill out these sources of meaning, right? That I had these ideas in mind of, like, what creates a meaningful life? Here are some areas that are important, And I, researched until I felt like I had a lot to say about each one of those. And I started to hear the same things more than once, and I felt like, okay, I mean, there's still, I'm sure, tons out there, but again, can't be comprehensive. So yeah, this is enough. This tells a story, and this tells the story I want to tell.
And as you were kind of pulling at those threads, was there something that you were surprised to learn during this research process?
Well, one was just how much there is out there, because that was, I mean, it really is endless and in a wonderful way. Also, one of the most kind of meaningful and memorable experiences of researching the book was going to Peru and speaking to women who weave there and for whom weaving is like so inextricably a part of life. I kind of, for me, textile work is very much a choice. When I started knitting, nobody I knew knitted. It was kind of a thing I happened to pick up at a hobby store and thought, I'll give this a try. But, talking to women for whom this is like a heritage, this is, they believe it's in their DNA, it's part of who they are. They can't imagine a life without it. There were many times that I would ask women, what would you do if you couldn't weave? And I can't tell you, like, the blank looks that I got from the women in Peru when I asked that question. They would say, like, "Well, I would spin," or, like, "I would tend to the alpacas," or something, and, but, like, they couldn't imagine doing anything really that would provide as much meaning and fulfillment as weaving does for them. One woman just, like, couldn't even answer my question, and my translator was just like, "Well, some questions have no answers." I was like, "I guess so." So, I mean, it was really incredible to encounter that, and I imagine that's how it was for a lot of women throughout history when it was such a, critical part of daily life. Women were likely spending 10 hours a day engaged in textile work of some sort in order to, like, provide for the needs for their families or their communities. And so, it would have been just so hard to even imagine what you would do with yourself if you weren't doing that.
And what do you hope readers take away from your book?
As I said before, one thing is definitely, kind of seeing the humanity of the women who have done this work. I think a lot of people talk somewhat disparagingly about textile work. You hear about grandma hobbies or, oh, some ugly sweater that my mom knitted me for Christmas or something that, like, I have to wear every year at Christmas to show her that I like it or something. These were made by people for whom it was meaningful. They put a lot of time and effort into these things, and it expressed something of themselves, either what materials they had to work with and how they made the best out of them, or the materials that they chose out of all the materials that they had available to them. These were the colors they chose, these were the, patterns they chose. And so I think that's really important. Also, I hope that people might look at their own work, whatever it is they do as a hobby or as their career or something, and think about what meaning it has for them. How do they create meaning and fulfill, themselves in these ways through what they have available.
That's a beautiful sentiment. And so, where should people go when they've finished your book and they want to learn more about you and the work that you do?
You can look at my Instagram, which is at Nicole Nehrig, my website, which is NicoleNehrig.com. And if you're a knitter or interested in my knitting, I'm Nerdy Knitting on Ravelry.
Okay. And we'll include all of that in the show notes for the episode. Now, we've only scratched the surface of this fantastic book. So, before I let you go, is there anything that we haven't covered that you want future readers to know?
I think, again, just maybe thinking about your own sources of meaning. And I think, you know, I say in the book, meaning makes a great number of things bearable, perhaps everything, which is a quote from Carl Jung. I think, we forget sometimes to look at what we're doing in our lives and create meaning and purpose. And, we can just be so busy checking off the to-do list every day and everything that we don't reflect on, what is this? How is this serving me? What is this fulfilling for me? So I think that's really the thing I want to leave people with.
Well, for all the listeners out there, be sure to pick up a copy of With Her Own Hands. It is a multi-layered exploration of women's work and a fascinating history of weaving and textiles, and would make a perfect gift for any knitting enthusiast in your life. Thank you, Dr. Nehrig.
Thank you, Alicia.
Thanks again to Dr. Nehrig for spending time with me. Be sure to check out the show notes to see where you can follow Dr. Nehrig, and be sure to pick up a copy of With Her Own Hands wherever fine books are sold. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you next time. Thanks for sitting down with me as I explored this chapter of American history. If you liked what you heard, be sure to subscribe and share with your friends. I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.